We've long known the government is pretty keen to exert pressure on the BBC. We know that they've managed to appoint Richard Sharp, Tory donor and chum of two prime ministers, to the role of chairman. We know also that Tim Davie, the BBC Director General, is also a former Tory councillor. But now The Guardian appears to have concrete evidence as to how government pressure affects what we actually see in the news. The evidence comes in the form of leaked WhatsApp messages and emails in which senior editors pass on requests from Downing Street to their own journalists. The Guardian reports this. One email shows a senior editor informing correspondents that Downing Street was requesting them not to use the word lockdown in relation to the shutdown ordered by Boris Johnson on the 23rd of March 2020, the day the first lockdown was announced. The email sent to correspondents at just after 6 p.m. on the day lockdown was announced was labelled Important Advisory Language Rebroadcast. Then in quotes, "Hi all, Downing Street are asking if we can avoid the word lockdown. I'm told the message will be that they want to keep pushing people to stay at home, but they are not talking about enforcement at the moment," it said. Reporters argued unsuccessfully against the advice, and thus the website and broadcast on that day spoke about curbs and restrictions on daily life, while other outlets such as rival broadcaster Sky were referring to the lockdown. Another example of the government appearing to successfully influence coverage also took place during the pandemic. So they say in another WhatsApp message from Sunday, 24th of October 2021, a senior editor asked journalists to make coverage more critical of Labour after a complaint from Number 10. The message reads, quote, "Downing Street complaining that we're not reflecting Labour's mess of Plan B online, i.e. Ashworth said it earlier this week, then reversed. Can we turn up the scepticism a bit on this?" The message was sent on the day Rachel Reeves confirmed Labour was calling for Plan B COVID restrictions, a policy initially announced by Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth, which was being resisted by the government. Downing Street argued Labour kept changing its position on COVID restrictions, and a line was added to the BBC online story to that effect. Now, in both these examples, what seems crucial isn't that the government have asked certain things of the BBC. Government press officers will make all kinds of requests of the BBC and all other outlets. That's normal. We want you to cover this in this way. But normally, what you'd expect is that journalistic outlet, especially if it's supposed to be independent and impartial, would say, no, of course I'm not going to take these kind of requests from you. But what you're seeing here is that these requests appear to be being passed down from senior editors at the BBC to their own journalists. So they're saying, Downing Street says this, can you do this? What starts as a request from the Tory government to BBC editors becomes an instruction from BBC editors to the journalists that work below them. And this might just be the tip of the iceberg. The leaks also show another instance where an editor appeared to praise journalists who stayed away from a story that was awkward for the government. So it's written here. This is the Guardian copy. In an email, a senior editor congratulated correspondents for staying away from the subject of Jennifer Arcuri after the American tech entrepreneur gave an interview to a newspaper in October 2020, appearing to confirm an affair with Johnson, following allegations that he used his position as London mayor to secure favourable treatment for her. The message to political correspondents from the 17th of October 2020 said, quote, "Journalist did a wonderful job last night, keeping us away from this story. I'd like to continue that distance. It's not a story we should be doing at this stage. Please call me if you're asked to." And while the leaks don't have concrete evidence that this followed a request from Downing Street, so we can't see them saying Downing Street has asked us not to cover Jennifer Arcuri, so we don't have that message. But it's plausible that that did happen, and the sources speaking to The Guardian were clear that this would be along the line of a trend. So let's have a look at this. One BBC insider said, quote, "Particularly on the website, our headlines have been determined by calls from Downing Street on a very regular basis. They said the messages would have been a small snapshot of what was going on because most pressure was applied verbally rather than written down." The source said management appeared to be worried about losing access to politicians and briefings from Number 10 if they crossed the Downing Street operation. And the BBC has denied the allegations. They've said the messages don't show that it buckled to political pressure. But World Affairs editor John Simpson isn't so sure. He posted this on social media. "No surprise about the pressure, it's always there. But the BBC's own rules on impartiality require us to stand up to this pressure robustly at all times. If we don't, we're not doing our job properly. And it's not our job to do Downing Street's bidding." So he seems to think there are some problems for the BBC in this article. Rob Burley also tweeted the article. He was head of live political programming at the BBC from 2018 to 2021. He tweeted this: very troubling evidence of the way that BBC executives operate in relation to government and how they put pressure on journalists to reflect the number 10 line. This goes to the heart of it and needs investigation. Dalia, what do you make of this particular story? I have to say, when it comes to sort of what lockdown should and shouldn't be called, I do think that's a grey area, because obviously during the period of the pandemic, there was a genuine sort of understandable blurring between sort of like political reporting and reporters playing this role of sort of giving information to the public, partly from scientific advisors, right? So that one doesn't seem terrible, but I suppose it's just very awkward. You've got these messages saying Downing Street want us to do this, being sent from a senior journalist to a more junior journalist. And then obviously the junior journalists interpret that as, well, Downing Street wants that, so I should do that. And then you've also got quotes from junior journalists or these sources saying, yeah, this happened all the time. And then you've got some very senior journalists, big public facing ones, John Simpson, and a former BBC journalist, Rob Burley, saying, yeah, this rings true. The BBC does conform to government pressure when it comes to what they put in headlines on the website or what they say in news bulletins.
When we're talking about a state broadcaster, impartiality is a very tricky thing to kind of achieve, because you're talking about a state broadcaster. It's going to cleave towards the establishment. There is going to be a kind of proximity there. And historically, this is not the first time that the government, when it has needed to achieve a particular message discipline, it has typically been able to enforce that through the BBC. The Iraq War comes to mind there. The BBC very much played a role in stigmatizing dissent against the Iraq War and kind of contributing to the kind of misinformation that surrounded the invasion of Iraq. So in a sense, that kind of isn't unprecedented. What I think is interesting here, though, and what may be different now, obviously we don't know. We don't always have access to text messages between, Downing Street and BBC journalists. But what I think is slightly different here is, as you said, this anxiety around the question of access, because typically that's not something a state broadcaster should ever have to worry about. Historically, the BBC is the first boot on the ground, particularly when it comes to what's happening in the British government. That's historically how the BBC has operated. And I think what was really interesting during the pandemic, a shift that I noticed, was that suddenly we were getting really important announcements and briefings about whether or not we were going to enter lockdown, whether restrictions were going to change, what was the government's next policy in the middle of a health crisis, was being delivered not necessarily by the BBC, but the first dibs were happening behind the paywall in the Telegraph, which of course was the newspaper where the Prime Minister had formerly worked. And so I think what happened in this government, particularly under Boris Johnson, was this cultivation of this cozy relationship where suddenly exclusives and, major announcements that really, should be going through the public state broadcaster, because announcements like whether or not we're going into lockdown, public health messaging should be funneled through a centralized, publicly and freely available news source, not, behind a paywall. And yet that wasn't happening. And I think that was an attempt by this government to cultivate this anxiety around access and to put the BBC on the back foot in this way in order to try and discipline the BBC. Into feeling like if it doesn't cozy up to politicians in this way, that they are going to somehow lose access, which is something I don't think the BBC has ever had to worry about. So whilst I can't really say for certain whether, these text messages like this are unprecedented, because we have seen historical examples where government message discipline has been funneled through the BBC and has been achieved via the BBC. I think anyone who, watches BBC coverage on Palestine, watch BBC coverage on the war in Iraq, will tell you that this kind of impartiality thing is a bit of a myth. What I do think is a concrete shift is the removal of certain kinds of exclusivity and access and the shifting of that towards media outlets that are more closely aligned with the ideological framework of the government. And I really noticed that when it came to who was getting the exclusives and who was getting the briefings on major government announcements in the middle of the pandemic. That to me was a marked shift.
The BBC, partly they feel like they need to, follow the government's lead because they're worried about, the next funding package they get, right? So the government can always dangle over their heads this idea of future cuts or changes to the operation of the BBC, right? That's why lots of people are saying it needs more independence. It needs much longer term funding deals so that the government of the day can't be constantly applying pressure in that way. But as you say, Dalia, I think also sort of media organizations competing with each other as to who can get the announcement first, which, to be fair, serves no public interest at all. It doesn't matter, let's say, whether this announcement comes or this revelation comes first via the Telegraph, the Times, or the BBC. We just want to know what the new announcement from the government is, right? But the government can say, oh, I'm going to give it to the Times, I'm going to give it to the Telegraph, I'm going to give it to the BBC. And then that means that all of these journalists at these organizations are trying to keep the government as happy as they possibly can. It seems like a system which serves no purpose other than to give the government control over the press. And to be honest, I think probably the press should club together and say, no, we're not going to play this stupid game, right? It's not in the public interest for us to be competing over who can get told something first by the government. If it's from an official government spokesperson, it should go to all of the press at the same time. And that would end this sort of sinister and pretty pathetic game where journalists have to sort of beg government officials and government spokespeople to be the first person they WhatsApp, which is essentially what's going on here, right? If you're hearing it from a government official, it should go out via official channels. That's what I'd say. If you've got someone who's leaking awkward information for the government, great. Yeah, obviously that's not going to go via official channels. It's great if journalists can build up relationships with government advisors who want to leak stories which might be in the public interest and which we don't know about the government. But if all they're saying is this is going to be announced tomorrow, that's completely pointless for all of us. All it does is creates this stupid competition, which means that we end up with media organizations going super easy when you've got governments making catastrophic mistakes.